Well, thank you very much. And I'm here to answer this question from my agency's point of view. And that is, we see a very important role for open adoption for children coming through the care system. And I'm going to talk a little bit to the research. We're doing a 3-year outcome study for all the children that we adopted. And I'm going to talk about some of the first findings of that. But I know that talking about open adoption raises a whole lot of issues for people. There are people who just cannot abide the concept of open adoption. Generally, from a closed adoption perspective, they find the breaking of biological bonds to be something very confronting. There are other people who simply can't understand that we can have a lot of families in the community who are very keen to have children and really want to provide a home for children, and they can't get access to, to really help those children and improve their outcomes. So because it's such an emotional issue, I want to start by saying 2 things. One is for any Aboriginal or Indigenous agencies that are here. I don't claim, I'm not advocating in this particular area, because I think every Indigenous agency really needs to make up its own mind, and Barnados is quite deliberately, at the request of Aboriginal agencies and SNAIC, has kept out of that space. So I can't talk to those issues. And then I really wanted to explain a little bit more about how we came to our very peculiar minority position on open adoption, because it's been hard fought. Over 30 years we've been working in this space, and we really believe in it. And we do so as an agency that puts the bulk of our effort into, am I going somewhere? I haven't moved. Into keeping children with their families. And we do very particular sort of work in the out-of-home care area, which was to split out-of-home care into crisis short-term care with the view to restoration and quick assessment, or we do long-term care, and we absolutely keep those things separate. And we have, as I said, been doing adoption from care for 30 years. About 6 or so years ago, we made the decision to move from the older age children, and because of the shocking level of damage we were witnessing there, we have moved to more emphasis on the very little children. We just couldn't bear seeing the kind of experiences that children have had. So our long-term care program, we take a great pride in how stable that is, and that top line is actually how many children, and you have to bear in mind that these are children who were given to us as unfosterable, really, and we keep them stable. We put a lot of time and money into that. We have a few who go on to subsequent placements, but really comparatively very few. The reason that we have moved to this position is really that open adoption stability rates are really good. Even the UK studies, Julie Selwyn's work is showing rates of around 3% dissolution, which compared with foster care, and I won't go through it, I've just got some of the international studies, some of which are pertinent to Queensland. But we're in this space, don't just talk placement stability, talk adolescent homelessness as well. I mean, it is really quite scary how many children on orders are going through the homelessness system. And the problems are getting greater. So I just want to read you, and perhaps this is the most telling part of what I wanted to say. We did some research in 2003 of the people coming through the adoption program, and we were astounded by what the kids told us. They never really, I'll let you just read them through them, never really feel that they belong even in long-term stable foster care. They somehow always know that there's that chance of being moved along. One of my things I want to talk to you about is the problems of long-term orders, which don't solve those problems. They just didn't feel, even in very stable foster care, that they could really settle. So we practice open adoption in two areas. One's New South Wales, and there's not going to be time to work through those provisions, but also in the ACT. And the laws in New South Wales are absolutely fantastic for us. We've worked very hard with governments to get them right. And I just thought you might be interested in seeing how those adoptions come about. Of the 210 people in this study, 35 had parental consent, and children over the age of 12 in New South Wales are able to consent to their own adoption, so we use that provision a lot. Many kids desperate to be adopted and really keen to exercise that right. Dispensation, roughly half of our people, and only 24 contested. And just to point out that difference, it's very hard for a birth parent to actually reach the point of saying that they consent to their child's adoption. Painful, difficult, this is all tragic work. It's a lot easier for a lot of parents just not to contest. Gives an important message for children. So I'll just talk quickly about the sorts of children who are involved. I'm not very good at coordinating this, am I? Okay. I talk some of these cases because one of the things that you find is people are very tentative about taking up adoption. Maybe we didn't do the right sort of early intervention. Maybe we're going into this a little too quickly. But this particular, I've got a few of these, so there's probably only time for one, but you know, our families are fairly typical, chronic domestic violence, a lot of substance abuse, very chronic problems, lots of children, numbers of children involved. This particular family was in trouble and then had a new baby and then twins. And then things went down the tube even further. So 2 of those children came to us and went to adoption. Very little likelihood those children will ever go home. So it's fairly typical of the children is very intense neglect, physical abuse, and multiple forms of abuse, which hopefully we're on the right slide. Okay. We have another child who I've got whose brother was killed by parents, and she was thrown downstairs, and very damaged little person. So we're dealing with really situations, I think, that it's very hard to argue that those children will ever find their way back home and that parents will be able to come back for them. We have some figures there just on the placement numbers that people have been through. You can look through that or look through it in the papers. But one of the things that I wanted to point out to you on the pathway of children towards adoption is just how many children came to the attention of the system as very little children. And many of them we've been able to get into adoptive families and have no more moves before their first birthday. We're really trying to move to make sure that this happens very, very much more in the future. It's probably not time to really go into the detail of that, but you know, I want you to really understand that these are very damaged children who we're placing, and they're very difficult children to manage. They've generally been with us 3 or 4 years in foster care before the adoption comes through. Birth parents, a little profile there of the sort of ages. They're often not young, and often been in, well, only a small percentage really have been in care themselves, many abused as children, and very similar profile for the secondary parents. There's a very detailed graph here which look at your leisure, which shows the sort of substance abuse, disability, cognitive impairment, violence very prominent in the children that we've adopted out. And I'll move on to this one, which I think is quite a telling little table, which is the number of children who've previously been removed from the parents that we have worked with. So I think our father with 6 previous children adopted, but there are some others there with 11 mothers who've had 4+ previous children removed. So we're dealing with a group of people with some fairly chronic and tragic lives. In contrast, the adoptive families that we have are a fairly stable group of people, and I say without apology that we're after moving children into middle-class, stable families that can give them opportunities. So a different socioeconomic profile, we may not like it, but they can offer children really such a lot. All our adoptions we begin, and indeed in New South Wales we have to have contact specified in the orders, and we keep that contact going. Barnados' recommendation is usually about 4 face-to-face contacts a year, and the study that we will be bringing to you in the next 12 months or so will really look at what happens to that contact over time. We're getting a picture of a fairly interesting pattern. Contact will drop off, kids will find families again, and I think we're really getting to the point of believing that the point about open adoption is that it keeps the conversations flowing in families about what's happening to their parents and to the children, and kids will not have contact for quite a while, but then go back and have subsequent contact, and sometimes decide they don't want us or don't want the contact. So it's a bit of a variable feast, and we'll have much more information about that. But all our adoptions started out as open and as inclusive as possible of birth families. We do a lot of work in those initial years of having a child about the issues of adoption, and we work very closely, and we absolutely enforce the rights of birth parents, and indeed, as you saw, some actually contest the adoption. So we ask ourselves, much as Selena's frustration came out earlier about why don't people understand, we realise that there's a huge value difference and a huge variety of views about adoption. One wonders if it's an adult rights versus children's rights matter, and we're fairly unapologetic that we will prioritise children's rights, albeit preserving the rights of birth parents. I think there is a lot of faith in early intervention, which I don't know is warranted. And of course, we've had the inquiries in Australia. There have been indeed, very tragic series of inquiries, and we are believing very much that open adoption can get around some of the issues that there are with the closed adoptions and the forced adoptions and all the ghastly practices that there were in the past. And I really would like to leave you with the thought that some of the lessons of those inquiries are not necessarily about the sacrosanct nature of the biological bond or the gestational bond, but they're also about listening to children. For God's sake, what's happening to the child in the middle of that? And it's also about the importance of having a family, because what people who are not prepared to look at open adoption are really condemning a lot of children to belonging nowhere. And we see the tragic consequences on the streets and in the homelessness services. So I think there's quite a lot of just not understanding what the research internationally is telling us too about outcomes, education, health, stability particularly. And I was just also wanting to raise this issue of third-party orders, which I think you're calling long-term guardianship in Queensland. There seems to have been quite a growth in that across Australia of recent years. And I just wanted to say that we believe this is the wrong way to go, that these orders are still challengeable by birth parents, and that challenge can be enough to destabilise the child, destabilise the placement. It's usually disastrous and it usually doesn't succeed. Secondly, these orders are a problem because children over, young people over 18 aren't covered by them anymore. So, you have this joy of lack of support for people. It doesn't happen in Canberra, I'm pleased to say, but it's still a problem in New South Wales. The orders don't give enough protection to carers, and I'd advise carers here to think very carefully about going down that track. And I think also another issue is it's very expensive to government, who still has to bear the risk on these placements and pay the costs. I want to leave just with one last point about money, which is on your research sheets. We do actuarial work every year and have done it for about 10 years to just show how much money an adoption can save governments, can put money back into better parts of the system, like better, more intensive support for families. An average kind of adoption is about $230,000 by the time you've looked after the child for a few years and done the work. For a child who leaves the system for some other reason apart from adoption, you're talking about $488,000, double the costs. And for children who age out of the care system, you're talking about costs of something like $688,000. So the whole system is destabilised by the continuing of keeping children in placements over the very long term. I don't think we can afford to do it for all the reasons that Selena outlined today, but a whole lot of evidence now that we can do better than this.